The bullet's heat singed Abigail's hair as time slowed to a crawl, the wagon tilting sideways in a spray of splintered wood and scattered grain. She threw herself over 10-year-old Liesel, feeling the child's fragile ribs beneath her protective embrace as their world turned upside down in a thunder of destruction. The mare's terrified whinnying pierced the evening air as 3 horsemen emerged from the amber wheat like harbingers of violence, their weapons gleaming in the dying light of another merciless day. Sheriff Rusty Joe Crawford dismounted with the casual confidence of a predator approaching wounded prey. His star-shaped badge catching the sunset's glow, a mockery of justice pinned to a vest stained with tobacco juice and moral corruption. Behind him, Greasy Pete spat brown streams into the dust, while fingering the pearl grip of his Colt, his eyes fixed on Abigail with the kind of hunger that made her skin crawl with revulsion. "Evening, Mrs. Henderson." Crawford drawled his voice, carrying the false courtesy that preceded frontier brutality. Mighty dangerous for a lady and child to be traveling alone after dark. All manner of terrible accidents can befall the unwary in these parts. Rattlesnakes, flash floods, desperate men driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control. Abigail struggled to extract herself from the wreckage, her emerald dress caught on jagged wood that bit into her flesh like hungry teeth. Blood trickled from a cut on her temple, but her green eyes blazed with defiance that 6 months of widowhood had only strengthened into steel. "You know perfectly well why we're out here, Sheriff. Your men ransacked our home this afternoon looking for something that doesn't belong to you or any earthly authority you represent. Now that's a harsh way to describe a lawful search," Crawford replied, circling the overturned wagon like a vulture examining fresh carrion. "We were simply looking for those surveying records your late husband left behind. Records that certain prominent citizens find troubling to their peace of mind and business interests." Liesel stirred in her mother's arms, her cornflower blue eyes fluttering open in confusion and pain. A gash on her forehead painted crimson streaks down her pale cheek, and her left arm hung at an unnatural angle that made Abigail's heart clench with fury. The sight of the injured child seemed to amuse rather than concern the 3 armed men who had orchestrated this carefully planned ambush. "Terrible shame about Henry's accident," Pete said with mock sympathy, his scarred face splitting into a grin that revealed rotting teeth. "Horse threw him right off that grain elevator platform. Could have happened to anyone, really. These things occur when a man gets too curious about matters that don't concern him, when he starts asking questions that make important people uncomfortable." The lie hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, heavy with implications that made Abigail's blood run cold. She had suspected for months that Henry's death was no accident. But the casual cruelty in Pete's voice confirmed her worst fears with crystalline clarity. Her husband had been murdered for the simple crime of possessing a conscience and the courage to document environmental destruction. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, pulling Liesel closer as the child whimpered in pain that no innocent soul should have to endure. Crawford drew his Colt with theatrical slowness, the metal singing against leather as it cleared the holster with practiced ease. "Simple proposition, Mrs. Henderson. You sign over that land of yours to Mr. Pike, fair price, generous terms, all legal and proper, and nobody else has to get hurt tonight. Child needs proper medical care after all. Can't have her growing up wild and unprotected in these dangerous times when civilization hangs by such a thin thread." The threat was as clear as mountain spring water before mercury poisoned it black. "Sign the papers, or watch your daughter die in this lonely place, where wolves would scatter the bones before morning," came with its false promises of safety and justice. "Never." She whispered the word escaping before courage could abandon her to desperation and compromise. Crawford's smile vanished like smoke in a windstorm, replaced by something cold and reptilian that belonged in the desert places where decent folk never ventured. He raised his weapon with deliberate precision, pointing it directly at Liesel's golden head. while his finger caressed the trigger with the tenderness of a lover's touch. Might want to reconsider that answer, ma'am. Time has a way of running out when you least expect it. The crack of a rifle from the grain stalks was sudden and sharp as breaking ice on a mountain lake. Pete's horse screamed and toppled sideways, throwing its rider into the dirt with bone-jarring force that left him gasping and cursing. The other mounts reared in panic as a figure materialized from the wheat, like a phantom born of earth and shadow, emerging from the golden stalks as if the land itself had decided to intervene on behalf of the innocent. The man moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned survival in the harshest classroom imaginable, where graduation meant living another day, and failure meant feeding the buzzards. Long black hair flowed behind him as he advanced, his bronze face marked by scars that spoke of violence survived and enemies conquered through skill and determination, rather than mere luck. He wore buckskin leggings and a faded cavalry shirt that had seen better decades, a Winchester rifle held steady in hands that had never known trembling. "Dasan," Crawford hissed, recognizing the Apache scout with a mixture of fear and hatred that twisted his features into something barely human. "This doesn't concern you, Breed." The man called Dasan ignored the slur with practiced indifference. His attention focused entirely on Liesel's still form with the intensity of someone who had learned to value innocent life above all else. He knelt beside the child with movements that were gentle, despite the calloused roughness of his fingers pressing his ear to her chest to check the rhythm of her breathing. With the care of a father examining his own offspring. "The child lives." He announced his English, carrying only the faintest trace of accent that spoke of languages older than the nation that now claimed this land. He looked up at Abigail, his dark eyes holding depths of pain that matched her own and the unmistakable look of someone who had lost everything precious and survived to fight another day. "Your daughter needs protection, and my name needs a family to make it whole again." Crawford laughed harshly, but the sound held no humor whatsoever, only the mockery of a man who found amusement in others' desperation. "You offering to marry this white woman, Apache? What makes you think she'd lower herself to your level? What makes you think any decent Christian woman would?" Dasan rose slowly, his rifle never wavering from its target center mass on Crawford's chest. "Under territorial law and tribal custom, marriage grants a man guardianship over his wife's children. Makes it considerably more difficult for corrupt officials to claim a minor requires supervision from the county." The implication struck Crawford like a physical blow, wiping the smirk from his face as he realized the legal trap closing around his corrupt schemes. Under frontier law, a married woman's children belong to her husband's protection, making it nearly impossible to claim abandonment or neglect without challenging the marriage itself. Practical arrangement. Dasan continued, something flickering behind his stoic expression like distant lightning. "You gain legal protection for the girl. I gain ammunition against the men who believe they can poison the memory of the land itself and expect the land to forget. But the land remembers everything, Sheriff. Every drop of poison, every innocent death, every act of greed that scars the earth." Pete was struggling to his feet, cursing and spitting dirt, while blood flowed from his split scalp that would leave permanent scars as reminders of this day's folly. The third rider had his hand on his gun, but seemed frozen by uncertainty, unwilling to test his draw against an Apache scout's reflexes honed by years of warfare. Crawford's face flushed red as desert clay, baking under summer sun. "You're making a grave error, Breed. Conrad Pike owns this territory, every blade of grass, every drop of water, every grain of wheat that grows in his shadow. He doesn't take kindly to interference from savages who don't know their place in the natural order of things." Dasan's smile was cold as winter wind across stone monuments to forgotten wars. "Tell Pike that Dasan remembers the taste of poisoned water. Tell him some memories run deeper than silver veins, and justice flows longer than any man's reach. tell him the land itself has chosen sides in this fight. For a heartbeat that stretched like afternoon shadows, the two men faced each other across the wreckage of shattered wood and scattered dreams. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife, while somewhere in the distance a hawk circled overhead, as if nature itself was bearing witness to this moment of reckoning. Then Crawford slowly holstered his weapon, knowing that federal law protected Apache treaty rights and that killing a tribal member would bring cavalry intervention that even Pike's considerable influence could not deflect or control. "This fight's far from done," he snarled with venomous intensity that promised future violence. "Pike has a long reach and longer memory for those who cross him. You've just painted targets on all your backs." The three men mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering darkness. But their threats seemed to linger in the cooling air, like the smell of gunpowder after a battle. Dasan watched them disappear before turning back to Abigail and Liesel, with concern replacing the cold warrior mask he had worn for their enemies. "Can you travel?" he asked gently, his voice carrying unexpected warmth now that the immediate danger had passed. Abigail nodded despite the fire in her ribs where the wagon's edge had caught her during the crash. "Where?" "My camp by the river, 2 miles north through the cottonwoods." He gestured toward the purple mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the darkening sky. "You need food, medicine, and time to consider my offer, without guns pointed at your child's head or threats hanging over your family like storm clouds." As he helped them gather their scattered belongings from the wreckage, Abigail found herself studying this unexpected savior who had emerged from nowhere to challenge impossible odds on behalf of complete strangers. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he lifted Liesel onto his horse, and she noticed how carefully he avoided any contact that might be considered improper by frontier standards. There was honor in his actions. Practical frontier honor, born of necessity rather than romantic sentiment, but honor nonetheless. The moon had risen full and silver by the time they reached Dasan's camp, a simple shelter of poles and canvas hidden among the trees beside Ghost Creek. The water ran clear and cold in the darkness, reflecting stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the velvet sky, with desperate fingers reaching for hope in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. "Rest," Dasan said, settling them beside a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls. "Tomorrow, we decide how to strike back against those who believe might makes right, and that the strong have divine permission to devour the weak." As Abigail held her sleeping daughter close, breathing in the scent of sage and clean mountain air, she gazed across the flames at this scarred warrior who had risked everything for strangers. Marriage to an Apache scout would transform her life completely, making her an outcast in most frontier towns where racial prejudice ran deeper than underground streams. But it would also provide the legal shield that her status as a widow could never offer in a world designed to strip women of power and protection. Perhaps it was time to choose survival over convention, strength over respectability, alliance over the illusion of safety that had already proven itself worthless against men like Pike and Crawford. 3 days earlier, the town of Willow Springs had basked under a merciless sun that turned Main Street into a furnace of dust ambition and barely contained violence. The heat shimmered off wooden sidewalks and tin roofs like visible malevolence, while dust devils danced between buildings like spirits of the restless dead seeking vengeance against the living. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Conrad Pike held court from his corner table like a king dispensing favors to eager subjects who hung on his every word. He was an imposing figure at 55, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the oppressive heat, and his gray eyes holding the kind of cold calculation that came from viewing people as resources to be exploited until they broke completely. "Gentlemen," Pike said, spreading a detailed map across the scarred wooden surface with the reverence of a priest handling sacred texts. "Progress is a river that must carve its own path through whatever obstacles nature places before it. The weak and the sentimental are merely soil that gets washed away in the current. Evolution demands nothing less than the survival of those strong enough to shape their environment rather than be shaped by it. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions, who had learned to dress brutality in the language of civilization and call it progress. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad will reach our valley by next spring, and when those steel rails arrive, every acre of prime farmland will be worth 20 times its current pathetic value. Greasy Pete nodded eagerly, his tobacco-stained fingers tracing the blue line that marked Ghost Creek's winding path through the valley, like a lifeline connecting scattered homesteads to their source of survival. Most of the dirt farmers are already hurting bad for water boss. Wells going dry faster than they can dig new ones, and desperation makes men reasonable, as you always say. Nature abhors weakness. Pike replied with false philosophy that disguised his greed as natural law. I simply help natural selection along its inevitable course. A man who controlled the upstream water rights might be able to assist his neighbors for a price that reflects true market value rather than sentimental attachment to worthless dirt. Sheriff Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking under his bulk as sweat stained his shirt despite the early hour. His discomfort had nothing to do with the heat, and everything to do with the growing boldness of Pike's schemes, which were attracting attention from federal authorities who might not be as easily bought as territorial officials. On Pike, you know, I've been looking the other way on your mountain operations, but if people start asking hard questions about why Ghost Creek's running so thin, if federal marshals start sniffing around, let them ask. Pike interrupted with a dismissive wave of his manicured hand. Questions mean nothing when a man's crops are withering and his children are going thirsty. Amazing how quickly principles vanish when survival comes calling with empty water buckets and the specter of starvation. The truth was both simpler and more ruthless than anyone in town suspected, hidden behind the facade of legitimate business operations that employed half the territory's working men. Pike's quicksilver mine, concealed in the jagged peaks 15 miles upstream, had been systematically damming and diverting Ghost Creek for 8 months. The silver extraction process demanded massive quantities of water for the mercury amalgamation that separated precious metal from worthless rock, while the toxic waste had to be disposed of somewhere convenient and invisible to prying eyes. Pike had solved both problems with characteristic efficiency: steal the clean water for his operations, then dump the mercury-laden waste back into the creek, miles downstream, where it wouldn't immediately affect his mining activities, but would slowly poison everyone who depended on the water for survival. The artificial drought was driving desperate farmers to sell their land for pennies on the dollar, while the slow poison crept through the water system like a silent assassin claiming victims one by one. It was a perfect system of environmental destruction and human exploitation, provided nobody looked too closely at what was happening in the high country, where eagles circled and secrets festered in mountain shadows like infected wounds. Outside the saloon, Willow Springs conducted its daily business with the determined normalcy that masked deeper troubles brewing like storm clouds on distant horizons. The town had the superficial appearance of prosperity: painted storefronts, busy sidewalks, the constant sound of hammers as new buildings rose to accommodate the expected railroad boom. But underneath the facade, something was rotting away, like fruit left too long in the sun. Dr. Edwin Clark made his rounds on foot, treating an alarming increase in stomach ailments and mysterious fevers that seemed to strike without warning or apparent cause. He was a thoughtful man of 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the quiet competence that made people trust him regardless of their opinions about race or politics. His medical bag carried more questions than answers these days, filled with remedies that provided temporary relief but couldn't address the underlying cause of the spreading sickness. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to trained eye symptoms that suggested poisoning, but from a source too diluted to identify through conventional diagnosis. Children who had been healthy and robust were growing pale and listless, while elderly residents were succumbing to ailments that should have been survivable with proper care and clean water. At the whitewashed schoolhouse, Miss Helen Patterson rang the morning bell with increasing melancholy, knowing that 4 more children had stopped attending classes this week. Their families had packed everything they owned into wagons and headed east toward more promising territories, unable to scratch a living from land that no longer supported life. She was a spinster of 40 with steel-gray hair and a backbone forged from pure determination, and the kind of woman who believed education could solve any problem if applied with sufficient persistence and courage. Her classroom, once filled with the cheerful chaos of young voices reciting lessons, had grown increasingly empty as families abandoned their dreams and fled toward uncertain futures in distant places. Each vacant desk represented not just a lost student, but a family's surrender to forces beyond their understanding or control. The sound of wagon wheels on packed earth drew her attention to Main Street, where Walter Jacobson was bringing his weekly load of produce to the general store. Though the load grew smaller each week as his crop struggled against the mysterious drought. The Norwegian farmer was built like a mountain with massive shoulders and hands scarred by decades of honest labor that had earned him respect throughout the territory. But lately, his weathered face carried worry lines that hadn't been there a season ago, and his blue eyes held the haunted look of a man watching his life's work crumble like sandcastles before an inexorable tide. His vegetables, once the pride of the territory, were stunted and discolored, while his wheat fields showed patches of brown that spread like cancer through what should have been golden grain. "Morning, Miss Helen." He called out, tipping his hat as he passed, with a courtesy that marked him as a gentleman despite his rough appearance. "How are the young ones today?" "Fewer of them every week," she replied sadly, unable to hide her growing concern for the community that was slowly dying around them. "Mrs. Henderson's girl hasn't been to school in 3 days running. I'm starting to worry about that family's situation." Walter's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over mountain peaks, and his massive hands tightened on the wagon reins until his knuckles went white with the force of suppressed anger. "Abigail's having troubles with Sheriff Crawford's men. They've been sniffing around her place like wolves, circling a wounded deer, asking pointed questions about Henry's surveying work, and getting aggressive when she can't give them the answers they want to hear." Miss Helen's jaw tightened with righteous anger that made her mild features seem suddenly fierce. Henry Henderson had been the county surveyor before his death, 6 months past killed, when his horse supposedly threw him near the grain elevator in what everyone had accepted as a tragic accident. But lately people were beginning to wonder why so many unfortunate mishaps seemed to befall anyone who asked inconvenient questions about water rights or mining operations. The town had once trusted in the natural order of frontier justice, believing that honest work and fair dealing would eventually triumph over corruption and greed. But that faith was being tested by a growing pattern of suspicious deaths, mysterious illnesses, and the slow strangulation of their community's lifeblood. 2 miles outside town, in a small cabin that had once echoed with laughter, but now held only the sound of a sewing machine's rhythmic clicking, and Abigail Henderson bent over delicate needlework that earned the few dollars keeping them fed. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency despite the ache in her back, from hours hunched over tiny stitches, each one a small act of defiance against the poverty that threatened to swallow them whole. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that needed washing, but soap cost money they couldn't spare for anything beyond absolute necessities. Every penny had to be carefully counted and allocated, every expense weighed against the harsh mathematics of survival that governed frontier life for those without the protection of wealth or powerful connections. Liesel sat at the kitchen table struggling with arithmetic problems that seemed impossibly complex for a 10-year-old mind already burdened with adult worries about money safety and the uncertain future that awaited them. Her golden hair caught the afternoon light streaming through windows, but her blue eyes held shadows that no child should have to carry. The notebook lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the window, Henry's final surveying project, filled with measurements and symbols that might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics carved by forgotten civilizations. Henry had always handled the technical aspects of his work, explaining only what she needed to know for maintaining household accounts and basic correspondence. Now she wished desperately that she had paid more attention to his cryptic marks and careful calculations that might hold the key to their survival. She could still remember the nights when Henry would sit at this same table by lamplight, making notes in his precise handwriting while she mended clothes or prepared lessons for Liesel. He had seemed troubled in those final weeks, staying out late and returning home with worried expressions he tried to hide from her questions. If only she had pressed him for details demanded to know what was casting such shadows across his usually cheerful disposition. A shadow fell across the window, like a dark omen, and Abigail looked up to see 3 riders approaching through the afternoon heat haze. Her blood turned to ice water as she recognized Sheriff Crawford and his deputies, their faces grim with purpose that boded ill for anyone in their path. A young Apache cowhand named Quiet Will watched from the nearby ridge where he was mending fence for Walter Jacobson, his dark eyes following the riders with growing unease that made his hands shake on the wire he was stretching. He had been working in this area for months, invisible to most white folks who barely acknowledged his existence. But he saw everything and remembered more than was safe for a man in his precarious position. The sight of Sheriff Crawford approaching the Henderson cabin filled him with a dread that went beyond rational fear, touching something deeper and more primal, the instinctive terror of prey animals when predators prowl nearby. He had seen Crawford before in circumstances that haunted his dreams and made his hands shake whenever the corrupt lawman appeared anywhere in his vicinity. But fear kept him silent, even as his conscience screamed for justice that seemed as distant as the stars. "Stay inside," Abigail whispered urgently to Liesel, moving toward the door on unsteady legs that threatened to betray her. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I call for you. Hide in the root cellar if you hear gunshots." She stepped onto the small porch, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins like liquid poison. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick and oppressive, while dust devils danced across the yard like spirits of the restless dead seeking vengeance against the living. "Sheriff Crawford, what brings you to our remote corner of nowhere on this fine day?" "Afternoon, Mrs. Henderson," Crawford replied, dismounting with deliberate slowness that suggested barely controlled violence lurking beneath his official facade. "We're here on official business, I'm afraid. Been some serious complaints about your late husband's surveying work. Seems there might have been significant irregularities in his final measurements that require immediate investigation." The words were spoken with bureaucratic authority, but Abigail could hear the threat underlying every syllable, the promise of violence that would follow if she failed to cooperate with whatever demands they were about to make. Henry was the most honest man who ever drew breath in this territory, Abigail replied with fierce conviction that rang like steel against steel. His work was always accurate to the inch, and his integrity was beyond question from anyone who knew him. Pete spat tobacco juice near her feet, the brown stains spreading across sun-baked earth like a pool of liquid contempt. "Funny thing about accuracy, ma'am. Sometimes a man sees things that weren't meant for public consumption. Records, measurements that certain parties would prefer stayed buried in private files where they belong." The third man, a nervous young deputy named Billy, who had known Henry Henderson, personally fidgeted with his reins like a man who wanted to be anywhere else in the territory. He had never believed the story about the horse accident, but questioning Sheriff Crawford's version of events was an excellent way to find yourself looking for new employment in distant territories where questions weren't welcome, and curiosity could be fatal. "We'll be needing to examine Henry's surveying records immediately," Crawford announced with bureaucratic authority that brooked no argument. "Official investigation, you understand. Direct orders from Judge Morrison himself." "I don't have any records here." Abigail lied with admirable smoothness, praying that her voice wouldn't betray the terror clawing at her throat like a living thing. Henry kept all his work papers at the county office in town, where they belong according to territorial regulations. Crawford's eyes narrowed to slits that seemed to bore into her soul with malevolent intensity. Now, Mrs. Henderson, we both know that's not entirely truthful. Every surveyor keeps private notes, backup measurements, rough sketches for personal reference. It's standard practice in the profession, and Henry was nothing if not thorough in all his work. When Abigail remained silent, desperately calculating her dwindling options while trying to protect her daughter from the violence that seemed inevitable, Pete took a threatening step closer that invaded her personal space with calculated intimidation. Maybe we should take a proper look inside that cabin just to make sure there's nothing you've accidentally overlooked in your grief. You have no legal right to search my home without proper cause. I've got all the right I need. Crawford interrupted, smoothly producing a folded document from his vest, with the flourish of a magician revealing his final trick. Search warrant signed by Judge Morrison himself just this morning. Now step aside, ma'am, or we'll have to consider you in violation of a direct court order. Abigail had no choice but to watch helplessly as the three men ransacked her modest home with systematic thoroughness, overturning furniture and emptying drawers in their relentless search for Henry's private records. They were methodical, but not needlessly destructive. They wanted information intact and usable, not ruined beyond recognition. Liesl huddled in the corner like a frightened rabbit caught in an open field, tears streaming down her face as strange men pawed through her precious belongings with casual disregard for her childhood treasures. When Pete grabbed her favorite doll and shook it violently to check for hidden compartments, she cried out in distress that cut through Abigail's heart like a rusty blade. "Leave her alone." Abigail snapped, moving to comfort her daughter with maternal instincts that overrode her own safety. Pete's hand shot out like a striking snake, catching Abigail across the face, hard enough to split her lip and send her staggering backward into the wall. The sound of the blow sowed through the small cabin like a gunshot, followed by Liesl's terrified scream that seemed to pierce the very air with its innocence and pain. "You'll speak when spoken to, woman." Pete snarled with vicious satisfaction that revealed the true nature beneath his badge and official authority. Liesl tried to run to her mother, but Pete caught her thin arm and twisted it behind her back until her face went white with agony that no child should ever experience. The sight of his daughter's pain nearly drove Abigail to desperate action that would have gotten them both killed. "Now then," Crawford said conversationally, as if casual violence was merely another tool of law enforcement. "Let's try this conversation again with proper respect for authority. Where are Henry's private surveying notes?" Abigail wiped blood from her mouth with a trembling hand, her mind racing through impossible scenarios that all ended in death or worse. She could surrender the notebook to buy Liesl's immediate safety, but something in Crawford's cold eyes told her that cooperation would only delay the inevitable. These men weren't planning to leave witnesses who could testify about their crimes. "I burned them," she said finally, the lie coming easier than expected. "After Henry died, I burned all his papers in the fireplace. Couldn't bear the memories they brought back of happier times when we thought the future held promise instead of threats." Pete increased pressure on Liesl's arm, drawing another cry of pain that seemed to echo in the small space, like the wail of a wounded animal. "You're lying through your teeth and we all know it. Check the ashes if you doubt me," Abigail said with desperate conviction that came from a mother's willingness to sacrifice anything for her child's safety. "You'll find charred paper remnants if you look carefully enough. I kept nothing that reminded me of my loss." Crawford studied her face for a long moment, with the intensity of a man trying to read another's soul, then nodded to Pete with obvious reluctance. "Release the girl. We'll conduct a more thorough search of the entire property later, when we have more time and proper equipment for the job." As the men prepared to leave their mission incomplete, but their message delivered with brutal clarity, Crawford turned back with a smile that held all the warmth of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Mrs. Henderson, I sincerely hope you'll reconsider your position on this matter before it's too late for reasonable solutions. A woman alone with a young child faces terrible dangers in this territory. Proper protection is absolutely essential for survival, and we'd hate to see anything unfortunate happen to such a vulnerable family. The threat was crystal clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had made similar promises before and followed through on everyone. After they rode away, leaving dust clouds and implied violence hanging in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, Abigail held Liesl close and tried to think of viable options that didn't end in graves. They could run. But where could a penniless widow and injured child hide that Crawford's network couldn't reach? They could stay and fight. But what weapons did a seamstress have against corrupt lawmen and ruthless land barons backed by unlimited resources and complete disregard for human life? As evening shadows stretched across the valley like grasping fingers reaching for whatever remained of hope and innocence, she made her desperate decision born of maternal love and absolute determination. Taking Henry's notebook from its hiding place, she loaded Liesl and their few precious belongings into the wagon. They would attempt to reach the territorial marshal in Shiloh, 2 days' hard travel through dangerous country where bandits and worse things hunted the unwary. It was a plan born of complete desperation. But desperation was all she had left in a world that had stripped away everything else she valued. The notebook represented their only hope of justice, their only chance of exposing the corruption that was slowly strangling their community like a noose tightening around an innocent neck. She never made it past the grain fields where golden wheat whispered secrets to the evening wind, and gunshots shattered the peace of another dying day. The morning after the wagon attack found Dasan tending a small fire beside Ghost Creek, while Abigail and Liesl slept beneath a canvas shelter he had constructed between 2 ancient cottonwoods, whose roots drank from water that still ran relatively clean in this upstream location. The Apache scout had been awake since before dawn, his weathered hands working methodically to prepare corn mush in a battered tin pot that had seen better decades and bore the scars of countless meals cooked over countless fires in the endless campaign for survival. His left shoulder ached, where old bullet wounds pulled at scar tissue with every movement, permanent reminders of lead taken during his years as an Army scout in the bloody Apache wars that had carved this territory from wilderness through violence and broken promises. Those had been different times when his skills at reading sign and tracking enemies had been valued by blue-coat soldiers who respected his abilities even while considering him fundamentally inferior in the grand hierarchy of civilization. The irony was not lost on him. He had fought alongside men who trusted him with their lives while still viewing him as a savage. A living contradiction that had taught him valuable lessons about survival in a world that despised his very existence, while depending on his knowledge to stay alive in hostile country where nature herself seemed determined to kill the unwary. Those years of service had left their mark, not just in the scars that decorated his body like a map of violence survived, but in the careful way he approached problems, the strategic thinking that allowed him to see several moves ahead in the deadly chess game of frontier survival. Mr. Dasan. Liesl's small voice drew his attention like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The child had awakened and was watching him with curiosity rather than the fear he had expected from a white child raised on stories of Apache brutality and savage warfare. Her bruises looked worse in the harsh morning light, painting her pale skin in shades of purple and yellow, but her eyes remained clear and alert. Just Dasan, he said, gently ladling mush into a carved wooden bowl that had been a wedding gift from his late wife, one of the few possessions he had managed to save from the fire that had consumed his old life along with everything he had once held dear. Are you hungry? The body needs fuel to heal properly, and you've been through quite an ordeal. Liesl nodded and accepted the bowl with both hands, careful not to spill a precious drop. She ate slowly, studying his scarred face, as if trying to solve a complex puzzle that adults had made unnecessarily complicated through their prejudices and fears. "Are you really going to marry my mama?" Dasan glanced toward the shelter where Abigail still slept, exhausted by pain and emotional trauma that would take time to heal completely. Her auburn hair spilled across the rough blanket like liquid fire. And even in sleep, her face carried the determined set of someone who refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds. "Only if she chooses to accept my offer," he replied carefully. "Marriage should never be forced upon anyone, regardless of circumstances or the convenience it might provide to others. It must be a choice made freely, with full understanding of the consequences." Papa used to say that Apache people were dangerous savages. Liesl observed with a matter-of-fact honesty that only children possessed unclouded by the social pretenses that governed adult conversation. "But you saved us from those bad men who wanted to hurt us. Your papa spoke partial truth about danger." Dasan replied carefully, choosing his words like a man navigating a minefield where one wrong step could destroy everything. But danger comes wearing many different faces in this territory. Sometimes the greatest threat carries a badge and speaks your own language with familiar words that hide poisonous intentions beneath a veneer of legal authority. Abigail emerged from the shelter at that moment, moving stiffly as healing injuries made themselves known with every step she took. Her emerald dress was torn and stained with dirt and blood from the previous night's violence. But she had attempted to restore some order to her appearance despite the circumstances. Her auburn hair was disheveled, and her dress bore tears in several places, but her green eyes still held the determined fire that had impressed Dasan during the previous night's violence. She was a woman who refused to break completely, no matter how hard life hammered against her spirit with relentless blows designed to crush hope and replace it with the bitter acceptance that seemed to be the common fate of those who challenged the established order. "Thank you," she said, simply accepting a bowl of the simple but nourishing meal with genuine gratitude that carried more weight than elaborate speeches. "For everything you've risked on our behalf. You could have stayed hidden in the wheat and let them finish what they started. No one would have blamed you for choosing self-preservation over heroics." Dasan nodded acknowledgement, but remained silent, understanding that words of gratitude meant less than the actions that would follow them. In his experience, white folks were quick with pretty speeches about justice and honor, but slower with meaningful change when it required genuine sacrifice or inconvenience on their part. He had made an offer of marriage legal protection rather than romantic sentiment, but the choice remained entirely hers to make without pressure or manipulation from him. The decision would change both their lives forever, and such choices deserved careful consideration rather than hasty promises made in desperation. "This proposal of yours," Abigail began carefully testing dangerous waters like someone crossing a swift river where one misstep meant drowning in circumstances beyond their control. "What exactly would such an arrangement involve for both parties? I need to understand the full implications before I can make an informed decision." "Formal ceremony before proper witnesses from both communities," Dasan replied with businesslike precision that kept emotion out of practical negotiations. Both tribal custom and territorial law recognize such unions when properly documented and witnessed by legitimate authorities. "Your daughter would become my legal responsibility under Apache law, making it extremely difficult for Sheriff Crawford to claim she requires outside guardianship or supervision." The legal implications were complex, but clear marriage would create a protective barrier that Crawford would find difficult to penetrate through normal channels of corruption and intimidation. It was not a romantic solution, but it was a practical one that offered genuine security in a world where law and justice were for sale to the highest bidder. And the more personal aspects of marriage, Abigail asked, her voice carefully neutral as she navigated the delicate territory between necessity and propriety. Dasan met her gaze directly, his dark eyes revealing nothing of whatever emotions might lurk beneath the carefully controlled surface. "I am not seeking a wife to warm my blankets or bear my children, Mrs. Henderson. I am seeking an ally in a war that began long before we met yesterday evening. You need protection for your daughter that only a husband can provide under territorial law. I need a reason to fight Pike's organization that white authorities will understand and respect, rather than dismiss as savage vengeance seeking blood for blood." The brutal honesty in his words was both reassuring and strangely disappointing, though Abigail couldn't quite identify why his practical approach left her feeling oddly deflated. Perhaps she had been naive to expect anything resembling romance from such desperate circumstances, but part of her had hoped for something more than mere legal convenience. "What war are you referring to specifically?" she asked, genuinely curious about his motivations and the pain she could see lurking behind his stoic facade. Instead of answering immediately, Dasan rose and walked to the creek's edge with the fluid grace of a natural predator who had learned to move silently through any terrain. He knelt and cupped water in his hands, holding it up to catch the morning sunlight streaming through cottonwood leaves that filtered the harsh glare into something almost gentle. Even from several feet away, Abigail could see the faint discoloration in the water, the oily sheen that spoke of contamination flowing downstream, like liquid death seeking innocent victims. The sight made her stomach clench, with growing understanding of the scope of Pike's crimes against both the land and the people who depended on it for survival. 2 seasons past, my wife Ayana drank from this creek during a particularly hot summer when other water sources had failed completely. He said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old grief that had settled into his bones like winter cold that never fully departed. She sickened and died within days, her body racked with convulsions, while poison burned through her veins like liquid fire. Our medicine man could do nothing. The contamination was something our people had never encountered before in all our generations on this land. He allowed the tainted water to drain through his fingers like liquid sorrow, watching it return to the stream that carried death to everyone downstream who lacked the knowledge or resources to protect themselves from invisible danger. I tracked the contamination to its source in the high peaks, to Pike's mining operation, hidden where few men venture, and fewer still return to tell what they have seen. They did not just poison the water, Mrs. Henderson. They poisoned the memory of the land itself, and the land does not forget, neither do I. The words carried layers of meaning that went beyond simple revenge, speaking to a connection with the natural world that most white settlers could never understand or appreciate. For Dasan, Pike's crimes represented not just personal loss, but a violation of the sacred relationship between people and the land that sustained them. Abigail felt her stomach clench with growing horror as she remembered Dr. Clark's increasing cases of mysterious illness throughout the territory. How many others have suffered from Pike's crimes against nature and humanity? 3 children from the Apache camp died choking on their own blood, while their parents watched helplessly. An old white farmer named Peterson, who lived too far from town to matter to anyone with influence or political connections. Perhaps others too proud or too frightened to admit they drank from a creek that everyone knew was becoming dangerous. But no one dared investigate. Dasan's voice remained flat and emotionless, but his hands had formed fists at his sides. Pike is committing murder for profit on a massive scale, and your husband discovered evidence of these crimes. The pieces began falling into place in Abigail's mind, like tumblers in a complex lock, finally clicking open after months of fumbling in the dark. Henry's secretive behavior in the weeks before his death, staying out late and returning home with worried expressions he tried to hide from her questions. The strange symbols filling his notebook pages with measurements and observations that she had dismissed as routine surveying work. His adamant insistence that she and Liesel avoid drinking creek water even during the most scorching days of summer when other sources ran dry. You believe Henry was murdered for what he discovered about Pike's operations. I know your husband was an honest man in territory controlled by thieves and murderers. Dasan replied with absolute certainty, born of bitter experience. Honest men rarely live long when they threaten profitable criminal enterprises backed by corrupt officials and unlimited resources for eliminating inconvenient witnesses. A distant rumble of hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, like thunder preceding a violent storm that would sweep away everything in its path. Dasan was moving before the sound fully registered in Abigail's consciousness, snatching his rifle and motioning urgently for her and Liesl to take cover behind a massive fallen log that provided excellent concealment from approaching riders. Through the morning haze, rising from the creek, like spirits of the restless dead, 4 riders approached at a steady pace. Too many for a casual patrol. Too few for an all-out military assault, but exactly the right number for eliminating specific targets while maintaining the illusion of legal authority. Sheriff Crawford led the group as expected, his badge catching sunlight like a mocking beacon of corrupted authority that had long since abandoned any pretense of serving justice or protecting the innocent. Beside him rode Pete and 2 other hard-faced men Abigail didn't recognize, all heavily armed and alert, scanning the tree line, with the practiced eyes of hunters seeking dangerous prey that might fight back with deadly effectiveness. From his position on the ridge above, Quiet Will watched the approaching confrontation with growing dread that made his hands shake like autumn leaves in a winter wind. He had followed at a distance since yesterday, unable to abandon the Henderson family to their fate, but terrified of the consequences if Crawford discovered his presence and connected him to the events that had already cost so many innocent lives. The young Apache had secrets that could destroy Pike's entire organization, but revealing them would sign his death warrant in blood that could never be washed clean from his conscience or his family's memory. Dasan. Crawford called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with false authority that fooled no one present. We know you're in there, Breed. Come out peaceful and nobody has to spill unnecessary blood this morning. We're reasonable men, willing to discuss terms. Dasan remained concealed behind the cottonwoods, his rifle trained on the sheriff's chest, where a single shot would end the corruption permanently and send a message that could not be ignored by Pike's other minions. State your official business, Crawford, then get off Apache land before you find yourself in violation of federal treaty obligations. Official business, as you well know, came the predictable reply. Mrs. Henderson and her daughter are wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of county surveying records and destruction of government property. And you're wanted for kidnapping a white child across racial lines, which is a federal offense in this territory that could bring cavalry intervention. The absurdity of the charges was breathtaking in its audacity. But Abigail knew that legal technicalities meant little in territory where the sheriff answered to the highest bidder rather than justice or law. Crawford was manufacturing justification for whatever violence he planned to unleash against them, creating a paper trail that would satisfy superficial investigation while concealing the true nature of his crimes. The child is under my protection as her legal guardian. Dasan called back with steady confidence that carried the authority of someone who knew territorial law better than those sworn to enforce it. Territorial law explicitly recognizes Apache marriage customs and parental rights established through proper ceremony, witnessed by legitimate authorities. What marriage? Crawford laughed harshly, the sound carrying no humor whatsoever, but only the mockery of a man who found amusement in others' desperation and suffering. I don't see any ceremony, any witnesses, any legal documentation filed with proper territorial authorities. All I observe is a savage holding a white woman and child against their will through force and intimidation. From their hiding place behind the fallen log, Abigail could see the trap closing around them with inexorable precision, like jaws of some massive predator that had been stalking them since the moment they decided to fight back against corruption and environmental destruction. Crawford wasn't here to make legitimate arrests. He was here to eliminate threats to Pike's criminal operation before they could present their evidence to authorities who might actually listen to truth instead of counting bribes. The kidnapping charge would justify whatever brutality followed, while any survivors would be dismissed as unreliable witnesses with obvious motives to lie about law enforcement activities that had been conducted according to proper legal procedures. But Dasan had spent years outthinking enemies who possessed superior numbers and firepower, learning survival tactics in the harshest possible school where graduation meant living another day, and failure meant becoming food for scavengers. His response was swift and devastatingly effective, drawing on resources Crawford had never suspected existed in this remote canyon. 10 bears. He called out in Apache, his voice carrying across the creek like a war cry from ancient times, when this land knew different laws and different concepts of justice. The answer came from 3 different directions as Apache warriors rose from concealment in the tall grass, like spirits materializing from the earth itself, armed and ready for battle. They had been watching the camp since before dawn, invisible guardians waiting for exactly this kind of trouble from white authorities who understood only violence and intimidation as methods of achieving their goals. Crawford's men suddenly found themselves outnumbered and completely surrounded by enemies who knew this terrain better than they knew their own names, trapped in a killing ground with no avenue of escape except through the mercy of men they had spent years oppressing and betraying. Now then, Dasan said, emerging from cover with his rifle still at the ready, but his tone suggesting willingness to negotiate rather than simply eliminate threats. Perhaps we should discuss this legal matter in a more civilized fashion befitting representatives of territorial government. An elderly Apache chief stepped into view with the dignified bearing of someone accustomed to command. In both peace and war, his presence transforming the confrontation from simple violence into something approaching formal diplomacy. 10 Bears was past 60, his long gray hair adorned with eagle feathers that marked his status as both war leader and treaty negotiator, who had dealt with white authorities for more years than he cared to remember. He wore traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of his achievements and honors earned through decades of service to his people. And his presence commanded respect, even from men who despised everything he represented in their narrow understanding of racial hierarchy and cultural superiority. Sheriff Crawford 10 Bears said in careful but precise English, learned through decades of difficult negotiations with government officials who viewed treaties as temporary conveniences rather than sacred obligations. You are trespassing on treaty land protected by federal law. Your jurisdiction ends at Ghost Creek's eastern bank, according to agreements signed by your own president and ratified by your Congress. Crawford's face had gone pale beneath his tan, but he attempted to maintain his crumbling authority through bluster and false bravado that fooled no one present. This is county business, Chief. These people are wanted for serious crimes against territorial government that take precedence over your primitive customs. The woman is Dasan's wife under our law and customs. 10 Bears replied with unshakable calm that spoke of absolute confidence in his legal position. The child is under his protection and ours by extension. If you have legitimate grievances, you must present them to the tribal council according to proper protocol established by federal treaty obligations that your own government is sworn to uphold. Wife. Crawford looked between Dasan and Abigail with obvious disbelief that such a union could exist or be recognized by any civilized authority. When was this supposed marriage ceremony conducted according to your savage rituals? 10 Bears produced a small leather pouch from his belt and shook several items into his weathered palm. With the ceremony befitting sacred objects, a silver bracelet that had belonged to Dasan's grandmother, a carved bone comb worked with traditional patterns that told stories of love and commitment, and a strand of beaded leather blessed by tribal elders according to customs older than the nation that now claimed dominion over this land. These were traditional Apache bride gifts, sacred tokens that sealed marriage contracts under tribal law, recognized by federal authorities who understood that treaties carried the force of constitutional obligation. The ceremony will be completed at sunset today, according to ancient custom. 10 bears announced with finality that brooked no argument or interference. All interested parties are welcome to witness as required by territorial statute and federal treaty obligations that bind both our peoples to honor legitimate unions. Abigail realized with crystal clarity that she was expected to make her choice immediately, in front of these hostile men with weapons drawn, and her daughter's life hanging in the balance like a sword suspended by spider silk over an abyss of violence and corruption. The decision would change everything about her future, making her an outcast in white society, while providing the only protection available in a lawless territory, where women and children were considered disposable obstacles to male ambition. But as she looked at Dasan, this scarred warrior who had risked everything to protect complete strangers without expecting reward or recognition, the choice crystallized with surprising clarity, born of desperation and growing respect for his courage and integrity. "I accept," she said loudly enough for everyone present to hear without doubt or hesitation, her voice carrying across the canyon like a declaration of independence from the social conventions that had failed to protect her family when protection was desperately needed. Crawford's expression shifted from confusion to pure rage that transformed his features into something inhuman and bestial, revealing the corrupt soul beneath the facade of legal authority. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You cannot seriously expect civilized authorities to recognize such a mockery of Christian marriage and proper social order. Territorial law explicitly recognizes tribal marriage customs when properly witnessed and documented." Dasan interrupted smoothly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knew legal precedents better than those sworn to enforce them. "Unless you're prepared to challenge federal treaty rights and invite cavalry intervention from Fort Apache to settle jurisdictional disputes." Crawford knew he was beaten at least temporarily by legal complications he couldn't overcome through simple violence or bureaucratic manipulation. Interfering with tribal sovereignty was a federal matter that could bring military investigation from authorities who might not be as easily bought as territorial officials, and even Conrad Pike's considerable influence had limits when Washington politics became involved in territorial disputes. But his parting words carried the weight of a death sentence delivered with venomous intensity that promised future violence beyond anything they had yet experienced. This isn't finished by a long shot. Pike doesn't forgive interference in his legitimate business interests, and his memory for insults is longer than territorial law allows for appeals or clemency. As the posse rode away in defeat, leaving dust clouds and implied threats hanging in the morning air like smoke from funeral pyres, Abigail felt the full weight of what she had just committed to settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak woven from uncertainty and desperate hope. She was going to marry a man she barely knew in a ceremony she didn't understand, to protect a daughter who was still too young to fully grasp the complexities of frontier survival and racial politics. But when she looked at Liesl safe within the protective circle of 10 Bears warriors, her bruises already beginning to heal in the clean mountain air, far from the corruption that poisoned the lowlands, she knew beyond doubt that she had made the only choice possible in an impossible situation that offered no perfect solutions. Sometimes survival required sacrifices that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with living long enough to see another sunrise in a world that seemed determined to extinguish hope itself through systematic oppression and environmental destruction. The ceremony took place as promised when the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting Ghost Creek in shades of gold and crimson that made the waters seem to flow with liquid fire, touched by divine blessing. Word had spread through both the Apache camp and Willow Springs, despite the obvious tensions and racial barriers that normally prevented such interaction, drawing witnesses from both communities who came partly from curiosity and partly from genuine concern for this unprecedented union that challenged every social convention of territorial society. Miss Helen Patterson had closed her school early to attend, bringing her small, leather-bound ledger to record the marriage for territorial records with the meticulous care she applied to all official documentation. Her presence lent crucial legitimacy to proceedings that some might otherwise dismiss as savage ceremony, without legal standing in civilized courts, and her reputation for honesty and integrity would make any challenge to the marriage's validity extremely difficult to sustain. Dr. Edwin Clark stood beside her with his medical bag at his feet, his attention divided between the wedding ceremony and the subtle signs of illness he observed in several Apache children, whose symptoms matched those he had been treating in town with increasing frequency. The contaminated water was affecting everyone downstream, regardless of race or tribal affiliation. But documenting the connection between Pike's mining operation and spreading sickness would require evidence that few people were willing or able to provide without risking their lives and the safety of their families. Walter Jacobson had come despite his failing crops and mounting debts that threatened to destroy everything he had built through decades of backbreaking labor in hostile country that tested every settler's resolve. He was driven by genuine friendship for Abigail and deep respect for the courage required to choose survival over social convention in a territory where conformity often meant the difference between acceptance and exile, to places where survival was even more precarious. The ceremony itself blended Apache tradition with territorial necessity in ways that honored both cultures without compromising either set of values or spiritual beliefs. 10 Bears spoke ancient words in his native tongue, while Dasan and Abigail stood together beside the flowing creek, their hands joined by a strand of leather cord that had been blessed by tribal elders according to rituals that connected them to generations of couples who had faced similar challenges in their struggle to build lives together despite overwhelming obstacles. The Apache language was beautiful and haunting, carrying meanings that went far beyond the simple English translations that 10 Bears provided for the benefit of white witnesses who could not understand the depth of commitment being pledged in words that had sealed marriages for countless generations. In the old ways, 10 Bears explained to the mixed gathering in his careful English, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that miscommunication could have deadly consequences. Marriage was alliance between families, joining strength to strength for mutual survival, in harsh country that tests every bond between human beings. This woman brings wisdom and fierce courage, proven in battle against those who would harm the innocent. This man brings honor and warrior skill earned through blood and sacrifice in service to justice. Together, they create something stronger than either could achieve alone in the struggle against forces that seek to destroy all that is good and clean in this world. The Apache words carried layers of meaning that spoke not just of romantic love, but of practical partnership, shared responsibility, and the sacred duty to protect family and community from those who would exploit the weak and vulnerable for personal gain. They described marriage as a fortress, built of mutual respect and common purpose, designed to withstand the storms of frontier life that had broken so many other unions. When the Apache portion concluded with traditional songs that seemed to make the very air shimmer with ancient power drawn from the land itself, Miss Helen stepped forward with her ledger and a pen borrowed from Dr. Clark's medical kit. Her movements formal and precise as befitted such a momentous occasion. Ekals, by the authority granted to me as appointed territorial recorder for this district. She announced formally, her voice carrying across the gathered witnesses with the weight of official sanction. I hereby document the legal union of Dasan of the Chiricahua Apache and Mrs. Abigail Henderson, widow, according to the laws and established customs of Arizona Territory. She wrote carefully in her precise script, noting the date, location, and witnesses present with meticulous attention to detail. that would make the document legally unassailable in any court that respected territorial law and federal treaty obligations. The marriage would be binding under territorial statute, providing all the protections Dasan had promised, while creating a historical record that could not be easily challenged or dismissed by hostile authorities seeking grounds for annulment. "You may kiss your bride," Miss Helen said with a slight smile that transformed her stern features and revealed the romantic heart she usually kept carefully hidden behind professional competence. "If that accords with your customs and personal wishes." Dasan and Abigail looked at each other for a moment that seemed to stretch like afternoon shadows reaching across the canyon floor, both acutely aware that this simple gesture would seal their partnership in the eyes of everyone present and commit them to a future that neither could predict or control. When he leaned forward to brush his lips gently against hers, there was nothing passionate about the contact, but there was something deeper and more lasting than mere romantic attraction. It was a promise of trust earned through shared danger of mutual commitment, tested by violence, and found worthy of two people choosing to face an uncertain future as allies rather than strangers struggling alone against overwhelming odds. The kiss spoke of respect rather than desire of partnership, rather than possession of hope, rather than desperation. Liesl watched from beside 10 Bears, her small hand clasped in the old chief's weathered fingers like a flower, protected by ancient oak that had weathered countless storms. She didn't fully understand the ceremony's implications or the complex legal and social ramifications of her mother's choice. But she recognized safety when she saw it after months of living in constant fear of violence from men who viewed her as nothing more than leverage to be used against her mother. For the first time since her father's death, the terrible anxiety that had haunted her dreams and made every day a struggle for normalcy began to lift like morning mist before the rising sun. The celebration that followed was modest but genuine, reflecting the practical nature of frontier life where survival took precedence over elaborate ceremony and ostentatious display of wealth. Apache women contributed clay pots filled with corn stew and fry bread, made from grain that had not been contaminated by Pike's mining operations, while Walter shared vegetables from his struggling garden that represented precious resources given freely in friendship, despite his own desperate circumstances. Dr. Clark brought carefully edited news from town, avoiding any mention of Sheriff Crawford's furious reaction to the marriage, or Pike's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control over his crumbling empire of environmental destruction and human exploitation. Miss Helen discussed ambitious plans for expanding the school to include Apache children if resources and political conditions permitted such integration, though everyone present understood the challenges such a project would face from those who profited from racial division and ignorance. As darkness settled over the camp, like a protective blanket studded with stars that had witnessed countless human struggles across the generations, the witnesses began dispersing to their own homes and responsibilities. Miss Helen packed her ledger with special care, knowing that the marriage record would need to be filed with territorial offices in Phoenix to ensure its legal validity against future challenges from hostile authorities seeking any excuse to invalidate the union. Walter hitched his team and prepared for the long ride back to his farm, pausing only to clasp Dasan's hand in the firm grip of one honest man, acknowledging another, despite the racial barriers that society insisted should divide them. "You did right by them both," the Norwegian farmer said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize genuine honor when he encountered it. "Henry would have given his complete approval if he could see how you've protected his family from those who would harm them." When only Apache families remained around the dying fire, their faces painted in shifting shadows and golden light that seemed to come from another world entirely. 10 Bears approached the newly married couple with an expression of grave concern that spoke of hard-won wisdom and bitter experience with white treachery. "Crawford will not accept this defeat gracefully. He warned with the certainty of someone who had dealt with corrupt officials for decades and learned to read the signs of escalating violence. Pike's influence reaches far beyond this valley, and his patience grows shorter with each setback to his plans for total domination of water resources. "What do you counsel?" Dasan asked, knowing that 10 Bears had survived numerous conflicts through superior strategy rather than superior firepower, and that his advice had kept the Apache nation alive when others had been destroyed by making the wrong choices at critical moments. "Fight intelligently, not merely with courage," the old chief replied with the authority of earned wisdom that came from watching too many good people die in futile gestures of defiance. "The white man's law is like a double-edged blade. It can cut both ways if you know how to wield it properly. Find proof of Pike's crimes that even corrupt judges cannot ignore, without destroying their own credibility and position in the territorial hierarchy." Abigail thought of Henry's hidden notebook with its cryptic symbols and careful measurements that might hold the key to Pike's downfall if properly interpreted and presented to authorities who still retained some vestige of integrity. "I have something that might help our cause, but I cannot interpret what it means without assistance from someone who understands both surveying techniques and legal procedures. Then we learn its secrets together." Dasan said simply the words, carrying more weight than elaborate promises or romantic declarations because they spoke to the practical foundation upon which their partnership had been built. That night, as Liesel slept peacefully between them in the canvas shelter, wrapped in blankets that smelled of sage and clean mountain air, untainted by the corruption that poisoned the lowlands, Abigail and Dasan talked quietly about the practical arrangements their marriage would require. Living situations, legal protections, and the delicate balance they would need to maintain between Apache customs and territorial law that viewed their union with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. It was not the wedding night either had imagined in their youth, filled with passion and romantic promises about eternal love, conquering all obstacles, but it was honest and forthright in ways that many conventional marriages never achieved despite their social acceptability and religious sanction. They were partners now, in the truest sense, bound together by necessity, but growing towards something deeper through mutual respect and shared determination to protect those they loved from forces that seemed determined to destroy everything good and decent in the world. "There's something Ayana used to say," Dasan said softly, his voice carrying memories of his lost wife, with the tenderness of someone who had learned to honor the dead without being destroyed by grief. She would point to that star there, the bright one that never moves from its position, and tell me that some things endure longer than the people who create them. "Love," she said. "Truth. The memory of courage when it's needed most." Abigail followed his gaze to the North Star, steady and unwavering in the vast darkness that stretched beyond human understanding. Henry had a similar belief about permanence and legacy. He used to say that a man's true measure isn't in what he builds for himself, but in what remains standing after he's gone to face whatever judgment awaits us all. I think they would both approve of what we've built here, however strange it might seem to others. "From necessity comes understanding," Dasan replied, echoing something 10 Bears had once told him during a particularly difficult period in the Apache Wars. "From understanding comes respect, and from respect—" He paused, looking at her across the dying embers that painted their faces in warm light. Perhaps something more lasting than either of us expected when we first spoke those words beside the creek. The conversation carried layers of meaning that went beyond simple acknowledgement of their changed circumstances. It was recognition that their partnership had grown beyond its practical origins into something that honored both their lost loves and their shared future, whatever form that future might take. "Do you regret this choice?" Dasan asked, as the fire burned down to glowing embers that would soon surrender to the cold reality of mountain night. Abigail considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, weighing her old life against this new path she had chosen, with full knowledge of the consequences and challenges that lay ahead. Ask me again when we're all still breathing in a month's time, and this war is finished one way or another. It was not a romantic answer, but it was truthful in the way that frontier life demanded practical honesty about survival rather than pretty lies about love conquering all obstacles through the power of good intentions and noble sentiment. On the frontier, partnerships built on mutual respect and shared goals had better chances of lasting than those founded solely on passion that could fade like desert flowers after a brief rain, leaving nothing behind but memories and regret for chances not taken when they were offered. In the distance, a coyote's howl drifted across the empty miles between the Apache camp and Willow Springs, its voice carrying loneliness, but not desperation, across the landscape that had witnessed countless human struggles for survival and meaning. For the first time in months, Abigail Henderson, now Abigail Dasan by both Apache custom and territorial law, felt something that might eventually grow into genuine hope for the future. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges and new dangers that would test their alliance in ways they couldn't imagine. But tonight, they were protected, united, and no longer alone in their fight against men who valued silver more than human lives, or the environmental integrity that made life possible in this harsh but beautiful land. The war was far from over, but they had gained crucial allies and legal protection that might allow them to survive long enough to see justice prevail over corruption and greed. If such a victory was still possible in a world that seemed increasingly dominated by those who recognized no law beyond their own appetites and ambitions. At dawn, Dr. Clark's vials clinked on the marshal's desk. Mercury traces matched the creek above Pike's sluices. By noon, the federal writ arrived. Crawford reached for his badge. Dasan's rifle made him freeze. At Ghost Creek Dam, Abigail pulled Henry's notebook from her shawl. Measurements stamped by Miss Helen aligned with a hidden diversion tunnel. Shots cracked. The dynamite charge was cut, the floodgates seized. By sunset, Pike was in irons, Crawford stripped of office, and warrants rode east with the marshal. That night, clean water rushed again. Liesel slept without fear. Under the cottonwoods, Dasan and Abigail said nothing. Justice is loud enough when the creek finally speaks.